Two Flower sat on his straw and stared into the darkness. He wondered how long he had been there. Hours, at least. Days, probably. He speculated that perhaps it had been years, and he had simply forgotten. No, that sort of thinking wouldn't do. He tried to think of something else. Grass, trees, fresh air, dragons. Dragons. There was the faintest of scrabblings in the darkness. Two Flower felt the sweat prickle on his forehead. Something was in the cell with him, something that made small noises, but even in the pitch blackness gave the impression of hugeness. He felt the air move. When he lifted his arms, there was the greasy feel and faint shower of sparks that betokened a localized magical field. Two Flower found himself fervently wishing for light. A gout of flame rolled past his head and struck the far wall. As the rocks flashed into furnace heat, he looked up at the dragon that now occupied more than half the cell.
"I obey, Lord,"
said a voice in his head. By the glow of the crackling, spitting stone, Two Flower looked into his own reflection in two enormous green eyes. Beyond them, the dragon was as multi-hued, horned, spiked, and lithe as the one in his memory. A real dragon. Its folded wings were nevertheless still wide enough to scrape the wall on both sides of the room. It lay with him between its talons. "Obey," he said, his voice vibrating with terror and delight.
"Of course, Lord."
The glow faded away. Two Flower pointed a trembling finger at where he remembered the door to be and said, "Open it!" The dragon raised its huge head. Again the ball of flame rolled out, but this time, as the dragon's neck muscles contracted, its color faded from orange to yellow, from yellow to white, and finally to the faintest of blues. By that time, the flame was also very thin, and where it touched the wall, the molten rock spat and ran. When it reached the door, the metal exploded into a shower of hot droplets. Black shadows arced and jiggered over the walls. The metal bubbled for an eye-aching moment, and then the door fell in two pieces in the passage beyond. The flame winked out with a suddenness that was almost as startling as its arrival. Two Flower stepped gingerly over the cooling door and looked up and down the corridor. It was empty. The dragon followed. The heavy door frame caused it some minor difficulty, which it overcame with a swing of its shoulders that tore the timber out and tossed it to one side. The creature looked expectantly at Two Flower, its skin rippling and twitching as it sought to open its wings in the confines of the passage. "How did you get in there?" said Two Flower.
"You summoned me, master."
"I don't remember doing that."
"In your mind. You called me up in your mind,"
thought the dragon, patiently. "You mean I just thought of you, and there you were?"
"Yes."
"It was magic?"
"Yes."
"But I've thought about dragons all my life."
"In this place, the frontier between thought and reality is probably a little confused. All I know is that once I was not, and then you thought me, and then I was. Therefore, of course, I am yours to command."
"Good grief!" Half a dozen guards chose that moment to turn the bend in the corridor. They stopped, open-mouthed. Then one remembered himself sufficiently to raise his crossbow and fire. The dragon's chest heaved. The quarrel exploded into flaming fragments in midair. The guards scurried out of sight. A fraction of a second later, a wash of flame played over the stones where they had been standing. Two Flower looked up in admiration. "Can you fly, too?" he said.
"Of course."
Two Flower glanced up and down the corridor and decided against following the guards. Since he knew himself to be totally lost already, any direction was probably an improvement. He edged past the dragon and hurried away, the huge beast turning with difficulty to follow him. They padded down a series of passages that crisscrossed like a maze. At one point, Two Flower thought he heard shouts a long way behind him, but they soon faded away. Sometimes the dark arch of a crumbling doorway loomed past them in the gloom. Light filtered through dimly from various shafts and, here and there, bounced off big mirrors that had been mortared into angles of the passage. Sometimes there was a brighter glow from a distant light well. What was odd, thought Two Flower, as he strolled down a wide flight of stairs and kicked up billowing clouds of silver dust motes, was that the tunnels here were much wider, and better constructed, too. There were statues and niches set in the walls, and here and there faded but interesting tapestries had been hung. They mainly showed dragons by the hundred, in flight or hanging from their perch rings, dragons with men on their backs hunting down deer, and sometimes other men. Two Flower touched one tapestry gingerly. The fabric crumbled instantly in the hot, dry air, leaving only a dangling mesh where some threads had been plaited with fine gold wire. "I wonder why they left all this," he said.
"I don't know,"
said a polite voice in his head. He turned and looked up into the scaly horse face above him. "What is your name, dragon?" said Two Flower.
"I don't know."
"I think I shall call you Nine Reeds."
"That is my name, then."
They waded through the all-encroaching dust in a series of huge, dark-pillared halls which had been carved out of the solid rock. With some cunning, too, from floor to ceiling, the walls were a mass of statues, gargoyles, bas-reliefs, and fluted columns that cast weirdly moving shadows when the dragon gave an obliging illumination at Two Flower's request. They crossed the lengthy galleries and vast carven amphitheaters, all awash with deep, soft dust and completely uninhabited. No one had come to these dead caverns in centuries. Then he saw the path leading away into yet another dark tunnel mouth. Someone had been using it regularly and recently. It was a deep, narrow trail in the gray blanket. Two Flower followed it. It led through still more lofty halls and winding corridors quite big enough for a dragon, and dragons had come this way once, it seemed. There was a room full of rotting harnesses, dragon-sized, and another room containing plate and chainmail big enough for elephants. They ended in a pair of green bronze doors, each so high that they disappeared into the gloom. In front of Two Flower, at chest height, was a small handle shaped like a brass dragon. When he touched it, the doors swung open instantly and with a disconcerting noiselessness. Instantly, sparks crackled in Two Flower's hair, and there was a sudden gust of hot, dry wind that didn't disturb the dust in the way that ordinary wind should, but, instead, whipped it up momentarily into unpleasantly half-living shapes before it settled again. In Two Flower's ears came the strange, shrill twittering of the things locked in the distant dungeon dimensions, out beyond the fragile lattice of time and space. Shadows appeared where there was nothing to cause them. The air buzzed like a hive. In short, there was a vast discharge of magic going on around him. The chamber beyond the door was lit by a pale green glow. Stacked around the walls, each on its own marble shelf, were tier upon tier of coffins. In the center of the room was a stone chair on a raised dais, and it contained a slumped figure which did not move, but said in a brittle old voice, "Come in, young man." Two Flowers stepped forward. The figure in the seat was human, as far as he could make out in the murky light, but there was something about the awkward way it was sprawled in the chair that made him glad he couldn't see it any clearer. "I'm dead, you know," came a voice from what Two Flower fervently hoped was a head in conversational tones. "I expect you can tell." Said Two Flower. "Yes." He began to back away. "Obvious, isn't it?" agreed the voice. "You'd be Two Flower, wouldn't you? Or is that later?" "Later?" said Two Flower. "Later than what?" He stopped. "Well," said the voice, "you see, one of the advantages of being dead is that one is released, as it were, from the bonds of time, and therefore I can see everything that has happened or will happen all at the same time, except that, of course, I now know that time does not, for all practical purposes, exist." "That doesn't sound like a disadvantage," said Two Flower. "You don't think so? Imagine every moment being at one and the same time a distant memory and a nasty surprise, and you'll see what I mean. Anyway, I now recall what it was I am about to tell you. Or have I already done so? That's a fine-looking dragon, by the way. Oh, don't I say that yet?" "It is rather good. It just turned up," said Two Flower. "It turned up," said the voice. "You summoned it." "Yes, well, all I did—" "You have the power." "All I did was think of it." "That's what the power is. Have I already told you that I am Grisha the First, or is that next? I'm sorry, but I haven't had too much experience of transcendence. Anyway, yes, the power. It summons dragons, you know." "I think you already told me that," said Two Flower. "Did I? I certainly intended to," said the dead man. "But how does it? I've been thinking about dragons all my life, but this is the first time one has turned up." "Oh, well, you see, the truth of the matter is that dragons have never existed as you, and until I was poisoned some 3 months ago, I understand existence. I'm talking about the true dragon, Draconis nobilis. You understand? The swamp dragon, Draconis vulgaris, is a base creature and not worth our consideration. The true dragon, on the other hand, is a creature of such refinement of spirit that they can only take on form in this world if they are conceived by the most skilled imagination. And even then, the said imagination must be in some place heavily impregnated with magic, which helps to weaken the walls between the world of the seen and unseen. Then the dragons pop through, as it were, and impress their form on this world's possibility matrix. I was very good at it when I was alive. I could imagine up to, 500 dragons at a time. Now, Liesa, the most skilled of my children, can barely imagine 50 rather nondescript creatures. So much for progressive education. She doesn't really believe in them. That's why her dragons are rather boring, while yours, said the voice of Grisha, is almost as good as some of mine used to be. A sight for sore eyes. Not that I have any to speak of now. Two Flower said hurriedly, "You keep saying you're dead." Well, the dead, you know, don't talk much. As a rule, I used to be an exceptionally powerful wizard. My daughter poisoned me, of course. It is the generally accepted method of succession in our family, but the corpse sighed, or at least a sigh came from the air a few feet above it. It soon became obvious that none of my 3 children is sufficiently powerful to wrest the lordship of the Wormburg from the other 2. A most unsatisfactory arrangement. A kingdom like ours has to have one ruler. So I resolved to remain alive in an unofficial capacity, which of course annoys them all immensely. I won't give my children the satisfaction of bearing me until there is only one of them left to perform the ceremony. There was a nasty wheezing noise. Two-Flower decided that it was meant to be a chuckle. So it was one of them that kidnapped us, said Two-Flower. Liessa, said the dead wizard's voice, my daughter. Her power is strongest, you know. My son's dragons are incapable of flying more than a few miles before they fade. Fade? I did notice that we could see through the one that brought us here, said Two-Flower. I thought that was a bit odd. Of course, said Grisha. The power only works near the Wormburg. It's the inverse square law, you know. At least, I think it is. As the dragons fly further away, they begin to dwindle. Otherwise, my little Liessa would be ruling the whole world by now, if I know anything about it. But I can see I mustn't keep you. I expect you'll be wanting to rescue your friend. Two-Flower gaped. Harun? He said. Not him, the skinny wizard. My son Leort is trying to hack him to pieces. I admired the way you rescued him. Will, I mean. Two-Flower drew himself up to his full height, an easy task. Where is he? He said, heading toward the door with what he hoped was an heroic stride. Just follow the pathway in the dust, said the voice. Liessa comes to see me sometimes. She still comes to see her old dad, my little girl. She was the only one with the strength of character to murder me. A chip off the old block. Good luck, by the way. I seem to recall I said that. We'll say it now. I mean. The rambling voice got lost in a maze of tenses as Two-Flower ran along the dead tunnels, with the dragon loping along easily behind him. But soon he was leaning against a pillar, completely out of breath. It seemed ages since he'd had anything to eat.
Why don't you fly?
Said Nine Reeds inside his head. The dragon spread its wings and gave an experimental flap, which lifted it momentarily off the ground. Two-Flower stared for a moment, then ran forward and clambered quickly onto the beast's neck. Soon they were airborne, the dragon skimming along easily a few feet from the floor and leaving a billowing cloud of dust in its wake. Two-Flower hung on as best he could as Nine Reeds swooped through a succession of caverns and soared around a spiral staircase that could easily have accommodated a retreating army. At the top, they emerged into the more inhabited regions, the mirrors at every corner brightly polished and reflecting a pale light.
I smell other dragons.
The wings became a blur, and Two-Flower was jerked back as the dragon veered and sped off down a side corridor like a gnat-crazed swallow. Another sharp turn sent them soaring out of a tunnel mouth in the side of a vast cavern. There were rocks far below, and up above were broad shafts of light from great holes near the roof. A lot of activity on the ceiling, too. As Nine Reeds hovered, thumping the air with his wings, Two Flower peered up at the shapes of roosting beasts and tiny min-shaped dots that were somehow walking upside down.
"This is a roosting hall,"
said the dragon in a satisfied tone. As Two Flower watched, one of the shapes far above detached itself from the roof and began to grow larger. Rincewind watched as Leoert's pale face dropped away from him. This is funny, gibbered a small part of his mind. Why am I rising? Then he began to tumble in the air, and reality took over. He was dropping to the distant guano-speckled rocks. His brain reeled with the thought. The words of the spell picked just that moment to surface from the depths of his mind, as they always did in time of crisis. Why not say us? They seemed to urge. What have you got to lose? Rincewind waved a hand in the gathering slipstream. Ashunai, he called. The word formed in front of him in a cold blue flame that streamed in the wind. He waved the other hand, drunk with terror and magic. Hibiris, he intoned. The sound froze into a flickering orange word that hung beside its companion. Urshoring, Kavanti, Python, Nigurad, Ferragomali. As the words blazed their rainbow colors around him, he flung his hands back and prepared to say the eighth and final word that would appear in coruscating octarine and seal the spell. The imminent rocks were forgotten. He began. The breath was knocked out of him. The spell scattered and snuffed out. A pair of arms locked around his waist, and the whole world jerked sideways as the dragon rose out of its long dive, claws grazing just for a moment the topmost rock on the Wormburg's noisome floor. Two Flower laughed triumphantly. Ha 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 ha! Got him! And the dragon, curving gracefully at the top of his flight, gave a lazy flip of his wings and soared through a cave mouth into the morning air. At noon, in a wide green meadow on the lush tableland that was the top of the impossibly balanced Wormburg, the dragons and their riders formed a wide circle. There was room beyond them for a rabble of servants and slaves and others who scratched a living here on the roof of the world, and they were all watching the figures clustered in the center of the grassy arena. The group contained a number of senior dragon lords, and among them were Leoert and his brother Leartes. The former was still rubbing his legs with small grimaces of pain. Slightly to one side stood Liessa and Harun, with some of the women's own followers. Between the two factions stood the Wormburg's hereditary loremaster. As you know, he said uncertainly, the not fully late Lord of the Wormburg, Grecha I, has stipulated that there will be no succession until one of his children feels himself, or as it might be, herself, powerful enough to challenge and defeat his or her siblings in mortal combat. Yes, we know all that. Get on with it, said a thin, peevish voice from the air beside him. The loremaster swallowed. He had never come to terms with his former master's failure to expire properly. Is the old buzzard dead, or isn't he? He wondered. It is not certain, he quavered, whether it is allowable to issue a challenge by proxy. It is, snapped Grecha's disembodied voice. It shows intelligence. Don't take all day about it.
"I challenge you,"
said Harun, glaring at the brothers.
"both at once."
Leoert and Laertes exchanged looks. "You'll fight us both together," said Laertes, a tall, wiry man with long black hair.
Yeah.
"That's pretty uneven odds, isn't it?"
Yeah. I outnumber you 1-2.
Leoert scowled.
You arrogant barbarian.
"That just about does it," growled Harun. "Oh!" The lore master put out a blue-veined hand to restrain him. "It is forbidden to fight on the killing ground," he said, and paused while he considered the sense of this. "You know what I mean, anyway," he hazarded, giving up, and added, "As the challenged parties, my lords Leoert and Laertes have choice of weapons." "Dragons," they said together. Liesa snorted.
Dragons can be used offensively, therefore they are weapons,
said Laoert firmly.
If you disagree, we can fight over it.
"Yeah," said his brother, nodding at Harun. The lore master felt a ghostly finger prod him in the chest. "Don't just stand there with your mouth open," said Greich's graveyard voice. "Just hurry up, will you?" Harun stepped back, shaking his head.
"Oh no," he said. "Once was enough. I'd rather be dead than fight on one of those things."
"Die then," said the lore master, as kindly as he could manage. Leoert and Laertes were already striding back across the turf to where the servants stood waiting with their mounts. Harun turned to Liesa. She shrugged.
"Don't I even get a sword?" he pleaded. "A knife even?"
"No," she said. "I didn't expect this." She suddenly looked smaller, all defiance gone. "I'm sorry."
"You're sorry?"
"Yes, I'm sorry."
"Yes, I thought you said you're sorry."
"Don't glare at me like that. I can imagine you the finest dragon to ride."
"No!"
The lore master wiped his nose on a handkerchief, held the little silken square aloft for a moment, then let it fall. A boom of wings made Harun spin around. Leoert's dragon was already airborne and circling around toward them. As it swooped low over the turf, a billow of flame shot from its mouth, scoring a black streak across the grass that rushed toward Harun. At the last minute, he pushed Liesa aside and felt the wild pain of the flame on his arm as he dived for safety. He rolled as he hit the ground and flipped onto his feet again while he looked around frantically for the other dragon. It came in from one side, and Harun was forced to take a badly judged standing jump to escape the flame. The dragon's tail whipped around as it passed and caught him a stinging blow across the forehead. He pushed himself upright, shaking his head to make the wheeling stars go away. His blistered back screamed pain at him. Leoert came in for a second run, but slower this time, to allow for the big man's unexpected agility. As the ground drifted up, he saw the barbarian standing stock still, chest heaving, arms hanging loosely by his sides, an easy target. As his dragon swooped away, Leoert turned his head, expecting to see a dreadfully big cinder. There was nothing there. Puzzled, Leoert turned back. Harun, heaving himself over the dragon's shoulder scales with one hand and beating out his flaming hair with the other, presented himself to his view. Leoert's hand flew to his dagger, but pain had sharpened Harun's normally excellent reflexes to needlepoint. A backhand blow hammered into the dragon lord's wrist, sending the dagger arcing away toward the ground, and another caught the man full on the chin. The dragon, carrying the weight of 2 men, was only a few yards above the grass. This turned out to be fortunate, because at the moment Leoert lost consciousness, the dragon winked out of existence. Liesa hurried across the grass and helped Harun stagger to his feet. He blinked at her.
"What happened? What happened?"
he said thickly. That was really fantastic, she said. The way you turned that somersault in midair and everything.
Yeah, but what happened?
It's rather difficult to explain. Harun peered up at the sky. Leartes, by far the most cautious of the two brothers, was circling high above them.
Well, you've got about 10 seconds to try,
he said. The dragons,
yeah?
they're imaginary.
Like all these imaginary burns on my arm, you mean?
Yes, no. She shook her head violently. I'll have to tell you later.
Fine. If you can find a really good medium,
snapped Harun. He glared up at Leartes, who was beginning to descend in wide sweeps. Just listen, will you? Unless my brother is conscious, his dragon can't exist. It's got no pathway through to this.
Run!
shouted Harun. He threw her away from him and flung himself flat on the ground as Leartes' dragon thundered by, leaving another smoking scar across the turf. While the creature sought height for another sweep, Harun scrambled to his feet and set off at a dead run for the woods at the edge of the arena. They were sparse, little more than a wide and overgrown hedge, but at least no dragon would be able to fly through them. It didn't try. Leartes brought his mount in to land on the turf a few yards away and dismounted casually. The dragon folded its wings and poked its head in among the greenery, while its master leaned against a tree and whistled tunelessly. I can burn you out, said Leartes after a while. The bushes remained motionless. Perhaps you're on that holly bush over there? The holly bush became a waxy ball of flame. I'm sure I can see movement in those ferns. The ferns became mere skeletons of white ash. You're only prolonging it, barbarian. Why not give in now? I've burned lots of people. It doesn't hurt a bit, said Leartes, looking sideways at the bushes. The dragon continued through the spinnery, incinerating every likely-looking bush and clump of ferns. Leartes drew his sword and waited. Harun dropped from a tree and landed running. Behind him, the dragon roared and crashed through the bushes as it tried to turn around. But Harun was running, with his gaze fixed on Leartes and a dead branch in his hands. It is a little known but true fact that a two-legged creature can usually beat a four-legged creature over a short distance, simply because of the time it takes the quadruped to get its legs sorted out. Harun heard the scrabble of claws behind him, and then an ominous thump. The dragon had half opened its wings and was trying to fly. As Harun bore down on the dragon lord Leartes' sword came up wickedly to be caught on the branch. Then Harun cannoned into him, and the two men sprawled on the ground. The dragon roared. Leartes screamed as Harun brought a knee upward with anatomical precision, but managed a wild blow that rebroke the barbarian's nose for him. Harun kicked away and scrambled to his feet, to find himself looking up into the wild horseface of the dragon, its nostrils distended. He lashed out with a foot and caught Leartes, who was trying to stand up, on the side of his head. The man slumped. The dragon vanished. The ball of fire that was billowing toward Harun faded until, when it reached him, it was no more than a puff of warm air. Then there was no sound but the crackle of burning bushes. Harun slung the unconscious dragon lord over his shoulder and set off at a trot back to the arena. Halfway there, he found Leort sprawled on the ground, one leg bent awkwardly. He stooped and, with a grunt, hoisted the man onto his vacant shoulder. Liesa and the lore master were waiting on a raised dais at one end of the meadow. The dragon woman had quite recovered her composure now, and looked levelly at Harun as he threw the two men down on the steps before her. The people around her were standing in deferential poses, like a court. "Kill them," she said.
"I kill in my own time," he said. "In any case, killing unconscious people isn't right."
"I can't think of a more opportune time," said the lore master. Liesa snorted. "Then I shall banish them," she said. "Once they are beyond the reach of the Wyrmberg's magic, then they'll have no power. They'll be simply brigands. Will that satisfy you?"
"Yes."
"I am surprised that you are so merciful, Harun." Harun shrugged.
"A man in my position, he can't afford to be anything else. He's got to consider his image."
He looked around.
"Where's the next test, then?"
"I warn you that it is perilous. If you wish, you may leave now. If you pass the test, however, you will become Lord of the Wyrmberg, and, of course, my lawful husband." Harun met her gaze. He thought about his life to date. It suddenly seemed to him to have been full of long, damp nights sleeping under the stars, desperate fights with trolls, city guards, countless bandits and evil priests, and, on at least 3 occasions, actual demigods. And for what? Well, for quite a lot of treasure, he had to admit, but where had it all gone? Rescuing beleaguered maidens had a certain passing reward, but most of the time he'd finished up by setting them up in some city somewhere with a handsome dowry, because after a while even the most agreeable ex-maiden became possessive and had scant sympathy for his efforts to rescue her sister's sufferers. In short, life had really left him with little more than a reputation and a network of scars. Being a lord might be fun. Harun grinned. With a base like this, all these dragons, and a good bunch of fighting men, a man could really be a contender. Besides, the wench was not uncomely.